And that's why democracy became one of the most important defining feature of American cultural life. And that is what the transcendentalist writers like Melville or Emerson and others like Whitman would emphasize, right? And Thoreau and so on and so forth. So how the whole emphasis on democracy is a defining feature of American cultural tradition and philosophical tradition, because you can see in some way Britain still has vestiges of monarchy, which provide a lot of fodder for scandals and gossips, but they don't have a say in everyday politics of United Kingdoms. So you can see that different histories, political histories, cultural histories have shaped American Romanticism. So a question that comes to our mind, can we think of Indian Romanticism, right? Which is similar, which has influence of British Romanticism, but then like American Romanticism, it will have a different ideological, historical, cultural emphasis. Is it possible to think on those lines? What do you say?
So, but then I do.
Your voice is. I can't hear you properly.
Am I?
Now it is. Now it's better. Now it's better.
Am I audible? What's happening?
Yes.
Okay. So, as I was saying, that when it comes to Indian context, I personally feel that I have sort of lost the definition of what romanticism is. Like, I can probably describe it in British terms or in American terms now, but then the essence of romanticism, that I mean, you know, it has been defined in very European terms itself, like by definition. So it kind of becomes a problem for me to even define romanticism. So I don't know how.
But you know, Indian writers were deeply influenced by Wordsworth, Coleridge, Emerson, Longfellow, Keats, Shelley, Byron, and their influence on Indian poetry is immense. People started writing poetry on nature. People in Gujarati, in Marathi, in Bangla, in Hindi, right? And there is something called Chayavad in Hindi, which is a rough translation of Romanticism, right? So if we can think Romanticism not as merely a European phenomena, but something that slowly spread across the planet, right? Then maybe we can think of how American Romanticism is different from British or German would help us to even think about how Romanticism in India, though influenced like American by the European Romanticism, is also different in its emphasis and history, right? That it may be possible. This is thinking comparatively. Okay, so let's look at Emerson, right? Emerson as yes, we need to have the context of industrialism. Yes, we did have industrialization in India after colonialism, right? Yes. Sumitra Nandan Pant and Mahadevi Verma, yes. Right. I completely agree, Digvijay. But then just like American is different from British, we can think of Indian Romanticism, though influenced by European, maybe different, right, in its history. One of the aspects of American Romanticism is, as we will see here, is to create a distinctively American tradition, right? Not rely entirely on the British and European model to develop their own intellectual and cultural and artistic tradition is one of the characteristic feature of American Romanticism, something that we discussed last time, which led Walt Whitman to use free verse and Emily Dickinson to use very idiosyncratic language with different kind of rhythms in her poems. You have studied Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. So on similar lines, I was thinking, right? So it's a different thing, yes, but then there was also industrialization in India as well. So industrialization began in mid-19th century in India, in big cities like Bombay, Calcutta, Chennai, Delhi, and it started expanding. In India, it started expanding large, and Mumbai was a specifically designed city by the Britishers as a commercial capital of the subcontinent, the colony. And they brought in people from several backgrounds, Parsis, Marwadis, South Indians, in order to develop a kind of commercial industrial base in 19th century onwards, mid 19th century onwards. So by the time we reach the beginning of 20th century, India is on its way to industrialization. Right before 40 years, yes, mills and power looms, right? And Ahmedabad was called the Manchester of East, and so on and so forth. Bombay mills became very important. There was a trade union movement in the beginning of 20th century in India as well. So urbanization, industrialization started making inroads. Not on the scale as that of America or Britain, of course, right? It's very small compared to America and Britain, but definitely there was. Okay, so let's look at Emerson as one of the key figures of American Romanticism, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, and some of his essays are the landmark essays in American intellectual and cultural history. One of those essays is Nature, written in 1836. American scholar in 1837, an address delivered before senior class in Divinity College is 1838. And then his other essays are History and Self-Reliance and The Poet. These are major essays by Emerson. In Nature, very typically romantic, right? The topic itself is very romantic. He's deeply influenced, and you will see, by two or three important tendencies. One seems to be Neoplatonism that we discussed last semester, that has entered European thinking very in German idealism. When we discuss Kant and Hegel, we notice the similarities between Neoplatonism and German idealism, right? So it seems to enter America through Emerson because he was also associated with Coleridge. So continental influences, that is the influence in the continental Europe, right, which is separate from Anglo-American traditions. Anglo-American is British and American. Continental is European traditions, French, Italian, German, Spanish, Greek, and so on and so forth. Those are continental traditions. So has entered Anglo-American tradition, right? German idealistic traditions. And almost reminding us of Fichte, but more of Hegel as well. He divides human existence into me and not me. So not me, everything that is not me is nature. And interestingly, it includes human body as well. Human body is not me. That's why you can get your kidney replaced. And so it is part of nature. So nature is what? It is not me. And he says that nature is apprehensible to children, eye and heart of the child, right? And this emphasis on child is also typically romantic. You know about Blake, right? Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, and child as the unique kind of subjectivity, which is pure, reminding us of Rousseau's ideas that man is born free everywhere he is in chains. So a child is by nature innocent, and this innocence itself is the sign of its purity and unity with nature, right? Something that you again find in Wordsworth's very famous poem on rainbow, if I'm not mistaken. The child is father of man. My heart leaps up when I behold rainbow in the sky. I don't know if you have heard of this poem. Child is father of man by Wordsworth. Have you heard of this poem? Yes. Child is father of man is from Wordsworth's poem. So this emphasis on childhood is also very romantic. And he sees that nature is part of God. Again, Wordsworth Coleridge Company Limited. And he traveled. Actually, Emerson went to Europe and met Coleridge and Wordsworth in person, right? So they knew each other, and he corresponded with him. And he studied Kant, Hegel, and other German philosophers. So nature is part of God. He believes that the love of beauty is gift of nature, and it comes in three parts. The lowest part is when we derive beauty from just simple perception of forms, like you watch a bird and you watch a mountain and you feel pleasure, right? That is the most basic lowest form of pleasure, aesthetic delight that you get. More higher form of aesthetic delight is something that inspires man to virtue, to be virtuous. For example, if you look at beautiful flower and you feel that you should be pure like this flower, fragrant like this flower, then that is a higher form of aesthetic perception. And then more higher form is when you start searching for the mind of the God in nature, right? Because nature reveals divinity. And you can see how this is very typically romantic. Another very important use or gift of nature is language. And this is very interesting. Nature has given language to man. And Emerson argues that all words that human beings use have some correspondence with the natural objects. And he gives example of how word right, has something to do with straight and wrong has something to do with twisted. Now, this is what he is indicating in the term, in the in his theory of language, twisted plant or branch. So every natural fact is a symbol. So there is a kind of language is emblematic, right? Language is symbolic of nature, and nature is symbolic of higher form of divinity or spirituality, spiritual facts. And again, this resembles Coleridge's theory of book of nature, right? So you can see how these are similar. Yes, Coleridge, because they knew each other and they corresponded. Uh, so again, like Coleridge, he says that universal soul is reason. Right? You can see heavy influence of Coleridge on him. That which is intellectually we considered reason, consider in relation to nature we call spirit. Last page 456. Yeah, Saloni, go ahead.
Yes, sir. It's on the page 456. Here we are talking about three things that are the gift of nature that Emerson has said. One is beauty, second is language. What is the third one?
अभी पहुंच रहे हैं हम वहां पे वो पेज
No, I
457
mean, I have missed the first one. The second is beauty, third is language. But what is the first one that I don't know? It's in the second paragraph. That's not clearly mentioned, so I'm not getting it.
It's not clearly mentioned, but what he seems to say here is that higher gift of nature is love for beauty. The lowest form of gift of nature is nature as it is pursued by a child, right? And this child, heart and eye and heart of child, who has retained the spirit of infancy, that provides a kind of unique relation with nature. So in case you have this kind of innocence, and I'm sure none of us have it, does anyone have it? I don't know. You can apprehend nature. So this is the primary gift, that you have some sort of oneness. And I don't know if you have read some of Wordsworth's Lucy poems. Even it's there in Wordsworth's many of his poems, where he says that the girl besides me is so innocent that she need not pray, because her innocence is form of prayer, because that makes her in touch with the divine in form of nature. It's poet who has to pray. Right? So that kind of affinity, apprehension is the first gift. Second is the love of beauty at several levels. Usme bhi staggered hai. And finally, gift of language. Is that clear? It's not 1, 2, 3 ऐसे नहीं दिया है, इसलिए confusing है. Is that clear, Saloni?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and he's also influenced by Carlyle, another very major British thinker. Okay, so this language is symbolic of nature. Nature is symbolic of spirit. Again, it all reminds us of various levels of Neoplatonic schema that we discussed last semester. Yeah, so Romanticism, one of the important features of Romanticism is turn towards Neoplatonism, while Neoclassicism was largely turned towards Aristotelianism and mimesis as a productive activity. Right? So Aristotle का influence primary रहा है, Wordsworth और Coleridge पे भी है, but it's secondary. Neoplatonism का primary है. Right? On Coleridge, on Kant, on Hegel, on followers, other philosophers of German idealism, Neoplatonism seems to be a major influence. Right? You can just brush up your Neoplatonism that we discussed last semester. Okay. So function of poetry and wise men on page 457 is to redeem language from its corruption, and to fasten words again to visible things. So this connection between nature and language has deteriorated throughout history. And the function of language, according to function of poetry, according to Emerson, is to redeem this bond between nature and language. And like Wordsworth, he wants to move away from urban spaces, right? What he calls the roar of cities or the broil of politics, and go to the lap of nature, right? Very cliche, to rejuvenate language. And he would argue that parts of speech are metaphors because whole of nature is metaphor of the human mind, right? And again, we are reminded of Hegel and Geist here. Material, page 457, first paragraph. Material phenomena is necessary ideas in the mind of God. And what is happening here is that while Hegel and Kant did talk about God, they were not so primarily spiritualistic. For them, rationality is more of pragmatic rationality of bourgeoisie, right? While Coleridge and Emerson seems to give it extra spiritual interpretation. Emerson and Coleridge seem to make it into far more spiritual outlook than Hegel and Kant would themselves do that. Right. So this reminds me, says Jaldi, of some kind of language purification thing. Yeah, even I can't remember, but this is a familiar idea, right? Okay. Spirit is also very Hegelian. So world themselves is made up of signs, and these are allegorical enactments of higher truths. I think Saint Augustine talks about how world is made up of signs, right? And you can see how this idea comes to Emerson through certain Saint Augustine's philosophy of Christianity, right? So how Christianity is also entering into the discourse here. I don't know if you remember 5th semester. 5000 साल पहले की बात है. Saint Augustine and the world is made up of signs. Another thing that nature gives us is, according to Emerson, discipline to understanding. Because it offers a lot of variety of materials which can educate our understanding and reason, scientific knowledge of the variety of the nature. Like botanists and zoologists can have huge amount of material to educate oneself. Nature is made to conspire with spirit to emancipate us. And in Hegel, this emancipation, or Kant, this emancipation is social and political freedom, right? Which here it takes on more spiritual connotation, thanks to people like Coleridge, maybe, and political conservatism of Coleridge. And like Coleridge, again, Emerson says that poet proposes beauty as his main end, whereas philosopher proposes truth. Nonetheless, both seek to ground a world of phenomena in stable and permanent ideas in an idea whose beauty is infinite. So, true philosophers and true poet are one. And beauty, which is truth, and a truth, which is beauty, is aim of both. Now, this sounds very much like Keats, right? That very famous poem called Grecian Urn. Have you read poem by Keats, Ode to Grecian Urn? Where it ends that beauty is truth and truth beauty. That's all you need to know. Keats, नहीं पढ़ा? So truth and morality and virtue still seem to be prominent in the ideas of Emerson, something which later on will be, I think, subjugated by people like Edgar Allan Poe, and in Britain, people like Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde, who will talk about art for art's sake, right? Which is the part of our next unit. हाँ हाँ आत्महत्या कर लेगा प्लेटो. His critics, Oscar Wilde as a critic, we'll discuss it in the next unit, right? Jaldi. Art for art's sake, aestheticism as the movement. Okay. So you can see all this sounds very much like Coleridge, and you can see a heavy dose of German idealism as present in American Romanticism, right? So you can see why we discuss Kant and Hegel at length, because to give you an idea of German idealism and how Coleridge and Wordsworth and Emerson are deeply influenced by German idealism. But we can also notice the turn towards Neoplatonism and the theories of Augustine, Christian ideas of world as made up of science, right? Natural science versus artificial science as a distinction given by Saint Augustine. So what we have to be aware of is continuities and differences, historical differences in these ideas. Now, this is what we mean by tradition, right? Tradition means you have ideas which are handed over to next generation, which uses those ideas in a very different way to engage with the questions and problems of their life, right? For example, Plato and Plotinus did not have to deal with industrial bourgeoisie or the ideas of democracy that you see in America or later Britain are not the ideas of democracy that you find in Greeks, for example. So these ideas are ancient, but they are recontextualized, reinterpreted to deal with contemporary social realities, right? So we are examining these ideas in their historical context, and we are also trying to map the shifts in the meaning of these ideas. At the same time, we are also trying to look at these continuities, right? And this is what we probably mean by intellectual tradition. So what we are doing is we are looking at criticism in the context of history and intellectual traditions of thinking. So you can see how Emerson belongs to that larger Western traditions of thinking, right? His another essay is far more influential than Nature, and this is probably the key essay here. And it's 3, maybe 5 minutes I can touch upon this. So I will stop at 12:45, and then we'll meet for the extra classes where we'll discuss it at length. So Emerson's essay, The American Scholar, is one of the most important essays in American cultural history. And the reason for it, it's a kind of manifesto for American independence in the domain of thought, right? And very famously, I don't know it's written here or where is it, I can't trace it, but it goes like this, that we have been listening to the muses of Europe for too long. It's high time we develop our own philosophical tradition, which is distinctively American in its outlook. So you can see how this nationalistic emphasis on difference, right, from the continental tradition is one of the important characteristic of American culture and philosophical traditions, if you want to use that word. And he says, yes, America's day of independence on foreign learning is drawing on a close, right? So it's a American declaration of independence in the domain of thought. That's why it's very important. Page 458. His basic premise is that there is one man, and this man is not a farmer or a professor or an engineer, but he is all. So the idea of man has not been divided by specialization and division of labor, is his vision of humanism, to use that word, right? In a divided or social state, these functions are parceled out to individuals. The original unit is the one man. It's the fountain of power, and it has been minutely divided and subdivided. So instead of saying he is a farmer and he is a doctor and he is an engineer and he is a professor and he is a computer engineer and this is a politician, you have to look at man from a different perspective. He says man is man farming or man trading or man thinking. So that is the premise, that's the fundamental thought of American scholarship. So he is giving a vision, a kind of vision for development of American scholarship, right? And it is based on the idea of this humanism, which is a kind of transcendental humanism. Why is it transcendentalism? As we have been discussing, right? It is all this American Romanticism का दूसरा नाम है transcendentalism, right? Is because the idea of man is transcendent to specific individual man who is defined by those professions. So somebody is a teacher and somebody is an engineer, but instead of looking at that person in this way, you should see as man teaching, man farming, man trading, right? So this is basis of transcendentalism. And you can see the word transcendental is differently used here from Kant's transcendental idealism. Transcendentalism here implies a kind of higher form of humanistic vision of a total one man, right? Rather than a specialized individual, a fragmented man. Instead of that, he's having a vision of total unitary human subject. Again, it's influenced by Hegel and others, if you can see. Is that clear? What is transcendentalism?
So could you please repeat that one line? Here
Which one?
for Emerson, transcendentalism is
The vision of vision of unified total man, rather than man divided, as you see in front of you. There is a teacher, there is a farmer, there is a politician, there is an engineer, there is a doctor, there is a lawyer. But instead of looking at human beings in this way, you see it as one man who is farming, or one man who is doing engineering, or one man who is teaching, right? So the idea of one man as transcending the individual specific fragmented man defined by profession is what we mean by transcendentalism, because it is beyond individual, right? Teacher is a fragmented person, but man teaching is you look at one man who is doing the occupation of teaching. And so it's also in some way egalitarian. The doctor is not less than farmer. After all, it's one man. So it's a humanistic transcendentalism. Does that make some sense?
Yes, sir.
Any other questions about what we have discussed? Okay, so in case you don't have doubts right now, maybe we can stop. You have a class at 1:10, right? So we meet at 2:45 as usual. Right?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
So we meet at 2:45 today and continue this conversation. Okay. So we are stopping the meeting here.